Hello everyone, my name is Victor Zberstis and I'm on the team working behind the scenes on worldcommunitygrid.org, which has been harvesting spare processing time from computers around the world since 2004, putting those computers to good use while they would otherwise be consuming electrical power just waiting for that next keystroke or mouse movement. One of the research projects on World Community Grid is the Computing for Clean Water project from the Tsinghua University in Beijing, China. They are studying water flow through carbon nanotubes with a hope that this may lead to much less expensive water purification and maybe even desalinization. Please let me introduce Dr. Francois Gray, who will give the English version of this lecture about the Computing for Clean Water project running on worldcommunitygrid.org.
Thank you, Victors, and thanks to IBM World Community Grid for this opportunity to tell you about our project, Computing for Clean Water. So on my second slide, slide 2, I show a list of humanity's top 10 problems, which was drawn up by Nobel laureate Richard Smalley, who passed away a few years ago. And what you see on this list is that water, that is the provision of clean water, is in the top 3 of the world's major problems. And indeed, a UN report from a few years back stated that by 2025, half the world's population would lack clean water. So today, 22nd of March, is World Water Day, which the UN has instituted as a special day each year. And this year, the theme is water and food security. So to explain on my third slide our particular angle on this topic, so we're interested in designing low-cost filters for producing clean water, and we're looking at using nanotubes, which are very small tubes made out of carbon, typically 1,000th of a millimeter across. So this ultra-small pore size means they're very effective at filtering out bacteria, for example. But there's also a challenge. Having such a small pore size means it's very hard to push water through such narrow channels, which means you need big pumps, which means that it's expensive to do. So the question we're trying to tackle is, can we somehow design some nanotube-based filters which have much lower resistance to the flow of water, so they don't need big pumps? So to do this, it turns out that to simulate on the nanoscale water flowing through these tubes, you need huge amounts of computing resources, and it's really only been able for us to study this on the scale of these filters recently, within the last year, thanks to World Community Grid and over 100,000 volunteers who've kindly contributed some of their computing time to this. And for those of you watching who are not members of World Community Grid, it's easy to join. Go to worldcommunitygrid.org/join, and you can help us as well as many other projects that are trying to solve difficult issues. So on my next slide, slide 4, I'd just like to remind everyone that the flow of water through narrow channels is a universally important phenomenon, and indeed is a key to the growth of plants. So this picture of a tree is a reminder that water is absorbed through the roots, but then travels up the tree by a process known as capillary transport, which involves flow of water through narrow channels, until finally the water evaporates from the leaves of the tree. And on my next slide is the sort of high school physics formula for how water in a capillary rises. And this is an experiment you can do at home with different sized straws, where you'll see that the water in the narrower straws moves further up due to capillary action. So the height of the water is inversely proportional to the tube diameter. And so on my next slide, slide 6, just reminding you that means in a giant redwood tree that you see here, there must be extremely narrow capillaries in order to suck water to such great heights up the tree. So on my next slide, slide 7, is a reminder that it requires a very large force to push water through a narrow channel. The reason being that, traditionally at least, our view of flow of water is that the water in contact with the tube does not move. It's sort of stuck. So the water near it has to be pushed quite hard to flow. So the flow, the force you need to create flow is inversely proportional to the fourth power of the tube diameter. That means the narrower the tube, the much larger force you need to push the water through. So on my next slide, slide 8, stepping back a second from this and asking the question, how do we clean water today? There's essentially two processes. One is distillation, that is boiling dirty water and condensing the evaporated water into clean water. And the other is a process called reverse osmosis, essentially pushing dirty water through a membrane which cleans it. And both these processes turn out to be very expensive because they require a large amount of energy. So there's a search on for better ways to do this. And so on my next slide, slide 9, I point out that a few years ago a discovery was made that really got people excited because a group in the US showed that an array of nanotubes could actually get water to flow through them at rates that were much higher than expected. The water was flowing much more easily than expected, thousands of times easier than people had anticipated by the classical calculations. So a lot of people got interested in this topic, and we're one of the groups, and we're looking at this, as my next slide shows, slide 10, we're looking at this problem with a simulation tool called LAMPS. It's freely distributed by Sandia National Labs in the US, and what it allows us to do, as shown in this picture, is simulate water molecules, the green dots in the picture, flowing through a nanotube, the blue tube. But in order to do this in a statistically reasonable way, we have to repeat these kind of simulations millions of times, which is why we need so much computing power to really study this process at the sort of flow rates that are typical in real filters. So on my next slide, I'm showing you some of the first results that have been published, including data that we got from the World Community Grid project. The point of this is what you see in this graph is the flow velocity or slip velocity and the shear stress, which is a measure of the resistance to flow. And as you can see, as the velocity goes down, the resistance to flow goes down. But the point is that most of these calculations were done before we had World Community Grid, and we could only study this system at very high velocities of hundreds of meters per second. So what we wanted to do, thanks to the extra computing power, was to follow these curves back towards the zero, to the origin, to find out what happens at much slower flow rates that are typical of real filters. And on my next slide, slide 12, what you see is the sort of detail that these simulations allow us to have. So you can really follow almost layer by layer how the water is flowing as you move away from the surface of the tube. And so this is the kind of information we're really after. And on my next slide, slide 13, you see some of the latest results from World Community Grid and our project. So we're able to track the flow of water to much slower flow rates than before, to even below 1 meter per second. And what we're seeing, very interesting, is that what we thought was just a linear behavior is actually more complex. There's a sort of oscillation that's visible here. So the resistance to flow doesn't just fall off linearly, it just kind of oscillates. And that means that at certain flow rates, there's very low resistance indeed. So at about 0.5 meters per second here, you can see that the resistance to flow drops almost to zero. And that's a very exciting discovery. Now it's for a particular size and shape of tube, so we want to reproduce it for other sizes and shapes. But if it's correct, what it means is that if you can control nanotubes in this way, you could get extremely low resistance to flow and maybe make much cheaper water filters. Of course, a very long way from a simulation like this to a result in the lab, and a much further way from there to a really practical device that can be used for filtering water. But these are very promising start. So on my next slide, slide 14, I just want to mention some questions that we'd like to answer now. One of them is to study in detail why these oscillations occur. So why the flow is different at low velocities, is something different going on than we've seen at high velocities. We're also curious to know how evaporation occurs out of the ends of the tubes, as that might tell us something about the evaporation of water from trees and plants. And finally, we're interested in how ions, different types of elements in the water, might be affected by the nanotubes. Indeed, how we might be able to filter out salt, which is in seawater, to produce drinkable water from seawater using these kinds of filters. So on slide 15, I'd just like to sum up what World Community Grid has meant for us. So previously we had of the order of 100 computers that we could use for this kind of calculation. And now, thanks to World Community Grid and all those volunteers, in just a few months we can do as much calculation as it would have taken us a couple of centuries to do in the past. So it's really quite mind-boggling what we're able to do. And in practice it means we're able to look for the first time at these very low flow velocities that are typical of real filters. So that's something of a breakthrough. So on slide 16, I'd like to just sum up the people behind this. So there's many teams involved. The project is led by Tsinghua University here in Beijing. It also involves Nanchang University here in China, Sydney and Monash universities in Australia, University College in London in the UK. We're a partner with the Citizen Cyber Science Center, which is based at CERN in Geneva in Switzerland, and which is a partnership with the United Nations. And last but by no means least, we have the great support of the World Community Grid team, without whom none of this would be possible. So on my last slide, I'd like to thank in particular all the volunteers, young and old, who've contributed to this. It's really quite humbling to think of the hundreds of thousands of people who have downloaded this software to help us. So thank you very much for your support in Chinese, xie xie. And again, a reminder that if you're not yet on World Community Grid, it's easy to join, worldcommunitygrid.org/join, and you can help us as well as many other worthy projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gray, for this informative talk about the Computing for Clean Water project running on worldcommunitygrid.org and increasing the awareness of how we are all helping on this World Water Day. I hope those all listening will also contribute their spare computing power by joining worldcommunitygrid.org. We have time for a few questions. Our first question is, how long in years do you think it will take to create a production purifying system based on this technology if all goes well?
Thank you, Victor. That's a good question. So getting from an idea and a result like this to a practical technology does take a number of years typically. So I would guess 3 to 5 years. There'll have to be some research and development done in laboratories, and then some scaling up by companies that think this is valuable. So if everything goes well, a result from this project might be in the hands of people within 5 years.
Okay, thank you. And here is another question. Are carbon nanotubes expensive to make?
So carbon nanotubes used to be quite expensive, but the price is falling all the time because chemical engineers have found new ways to mass produce them. So here at Tsinghua University, in fact, in our center, we have a group that's producing kilos of this on a daily basis. So the price is coming to the level of the price of metals, say, and will be in the future the price of plastics. So not expensive at all.
We have another question. Are carbon nanotubes dangerous?
So carbon nanotubes, if produced as dust in the atmosphere and inhaled, could be dangerous, as indeed any very small particles can be. I just remind you that smoke from cigarettes is essentially nanoparticles, and we all know that inhaling that is dangerous. But the nanotubes we're talking about here are in a matrix. They're embedded in it, so they really can't move out of that, so they're not dangerous in any sense.
How many years were you previously exploring the technology prior to World Community Grid contributing to your project?
So here at Tsinghua, the group was studying this sort of flow in nanotubes for about 3 years prior to starting with World Community Grid. But other groups have been studying this for a good deal longer.
And we have another question. What keeps the carbon nanotubes from breaking loose or water leaking by them?
That's a good question, Victor. So the filters, of course, are made as robust as one can by embedding the nanotubes in a tough plastic, and that should last a long time. But just like any machine or device, after a lot of use, membranes like this, filters like this, will break and have to be replaced. So part of the challenge when industrializing this kind of technology is figuring out the most robust way to make them, and also cheap ways to replace filters once they're broken.
Okay. And one final question. How do you keep the nanotubes from getting clogged up with larger particles?
Again, this is an important issue that there's no perfect solution to, but basically there are different ways of pre-filtering. So you take out the worst gunk, as it were, and make sure that the water that's going through the filter is the stuff you want to get bacteria out of, for example. And then there's ways of cleaning off the filter surface on a regular basis, so that it doesn't get clogged up. But indeed, eventually filters do get clogged up, they get less efficient, and that's when they have to be replaced as well.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Gray, and those attending. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. Please use our forums at World Community Grid to post any additional questions. This concludes our webcast. There will be a recorded Chinese version on our website later. Thank you.